Much. Round of applause for Liran.
Hi, everyone. Many amazing and beautiful faces. And it's an honor to basically celebrate open source with you, because open source is amazing. And there are not a lot of conferences and events and communities dedicated just for that. So I wanted to start off this with a personal story. And think about it for a second, like how did open source maybe change your lives? I know how it changed mine. I wanted to share this a little bit with you as we start off. So for me, from being a very early childhood kid back in the day, it allowed me to kind of understand and be familiar with the free and open source software movement, meet many new friends over the internet, over pre-internet days. For maybe some of you here who have not experienced modem dial-up, it's been amazing. But just the ability to connect with other people, build things together, reach out, to do all of this in an open manner where it is transparently being done has been a life-changing experience, very transformative. So I wholeheartedly recommend that to anyone who hasn't done that yet and want to just dive in. And so I think one of the other things that open source is providing that is very valuable for us is the fact that it provides us opportunities, right? Opportunities for growth, because we may learn new things as we interact with more people. For me, it also provided the ability to actually have impact on other people's lives. About 2 decades ago, I wrote this open source program called Radius. It basically managed Radius servers for managing users and Wi-Fi hotspots and things like that. Again, this is like very early internet days, where internet was not very ubiquitous, so we needed something to manage all of this. So it was PHP, back in the day, open source still, but like on SourceForge, which is not GitHub, so not as cool, but like very different, still, the mainstream to find open source software. And it did really well. This is a niche project for like sysadmins, network operators, but over about 10 years, over a decade, it got up to 500,000 downloads, which to me was amazing, not just because of the amount of downloads, but because this software was specifically intended and built so that other people could actually build businesses around them, like Wi-Fi hotspots where you go to a hotel or some place over coffee, maybe pay some money and get a user to surf the internet. That's what this software basically allowed people. So it allowed me to create impact and allow other people to build their own business and provide to their families based on this. It's been amazing. It's been an amazing ride because I've seen how actually people put, the Radius name on their LinkedIn profile, and it was like, part of their job and then career. And it's like a lot of impact that, I was able to do. And I was very humbled by this, how big it was. These days, though, the graph kind of like deteriorates, right? Like something happens there. And so this is what I wanted to talk to you today about. My name is Liran. I'm a developer advocate at Snyk, where we build developer-first security tools, help developers build in a secure way and ship their applications in a secure way, but from the developer perspective. I also do a bunch of other things around web security and open source and JavaScript and Node. So happy to chat with all of you about this afterwards if anyone has any questions or just want to join up. And so I wanted to specifically take maybe a different approach to open source or to open this conference, and that is talking about the fact that sometimes libraries, open source libraries, go to die. Sometimes very quietly, sometimes not. And kind of shed a light of like, why does that happen? But to understand that a little bit more, we kind of like need to understand some other things that are happening in the ecosystem. Like, why has open source grown so much? Why has it been adopted so much? One of those other reasons, and this is from a survey from 2015, showing that mostly the permissive licenses on GitHub has been the ones that have been more widely spread, more widely adopted. We've seen something similar with Tidelift in a very recent report, who just said, about 90% of those 2 million packages on NPM are using permissive licenses like Apache, like BSD, like ISC, like MIT, and they basically allow all of us to build upon open source software. But with that, going forward, are we taking open source for granted? Are we just using it and not understanding what are the actual implications, what are the actual risks around it? What happens when we do take it for granted? what happens to us as consumers. So first off, maybe let's start. Story number 1, left pad. This is basically a story of how legal actions by one commercial entity were conducted against another open source developer. I appreciate some people probably are aware of this story, as it's been very, very impactful on the JavaScript ecosystem as well. And so let's start off with what was happening there and how it affected projects like Node.js and Babel to basically break their builds. So one thing to start off with is the fact that this is kind of like what you see here is basically a fallacy of software development. Why is that? Because traditional software development is taking into account the developers in a team. But what we may forget sometimes that there are more things happening. Well, first off, the traditional aspect here is coffee goes in, software goes out, right? Okay. Well, let's do the same analogy. Open source packages go in, software goes out, products go out, right? It helps us build our products. That's amazing. That's why this is a bit of a fallacy, right? Like all the product that we ship outside, it's not just our own code. Sometimes a lot of other maintainers' code, like some of them that literally sit here in the crowd. One of them is Azure. He's one developer who actually owns and maintains hundreds of other NPM modules back at that time. And so maybe they use one of his modules. Actually, perhaps they did. One of those modules on NPM was actually called Kik. Kik was coincidentally a name of another very popular messenger app, and that company who owned the messenger app wanted to, get the NPM package name called Kik. Maybe they wanted, an SDK or whatever, and so they reached out and asked Azure to release the name. He did not want to release the name, and that's very understandable. He was there first. He built an open source package for it, as part of some other things as well. And so what happens is there's now a conflict that needs to be mitigated in some way. And the actual activity tried to be sorting out the conflict, right? There's like lawyers around this, there's like NPM around this. Should we release the name, not release the name, what actually happens? Well, he did not want to get sued and face a lawsuit. And at the end of the day, he ended protesting about it by basically removing all of his NPM modules from the ecosystem. Only problem was that one of them, along with Kik, was LeftPad. And LeftPad was a small library today, luckily for us, in the JavaScript language support. But back then it wasn't, and a lot of other packages were indirectly also, without knowing that they are maybe relied upon it, like Node.js and Babel and many other CI systems that were just like bluntly crushing all over the internet. And indeed, many, many projects needed to resolve and figure out what happened, because when he released all of his modules, released as in yanking them, removing them from the NPM package, now when you build projects, they're just not available anymore. So some learnings here. And hopefully some of you already practiced this. What could you take away from this story? So first off, as you may be consuming a lot of open source software, it is very wise to maybe include something like an internal NPM proxy, or for other ecosystems exist as well, some other projects. For open source JavaScript, you could use something like Verdaccio, which I'll talk about here in a sec. But it's essentially an open source project. Containerize it, just bring it up. It allows you to essentially have your own kind of NPM private instance. You can have private packages, but it also caches them and allows you to do offline downloads. And so if something happens to a package outside on like the public registry, you are not immediately affected by this. So highly think of considering using open source in this kind of more responsible manner. Story number 2 here is about how one maintainer was able to actually depart from their project just to save, or try to save, planet Earth. Ask yourself for a second, if you had a library that had tens or hundreds of millions of downloads, would you be able to see that it may be a bad impact on planet Earth and climate in some way, and then just say, I do not want to maintain it anymore, it's now deprecated? So let's see what happens there. Meet Francois. Back in 2011, Francois actually is a PHP developer, maintainer. He created this project called the Faker PHP library. Obviously, as its name kind of like says, it allows you to create fakes and seed databases and testing, and it's like really useful for those kind of things. Faker grew over time very, very much. It grew to an extent where it actually had tens and hundreds of projects depending on it, then hundreds of thousands, and then millions of downloads. This, of course, happened over time, and this library that provided more and more ability to fake data, to provide you to mock things like an address of someone, their first name, different languages, SDKs to Python and Ruby and different ecosystems, had made it grown very, very large, but also the library itself became large by default, 3 megabytes. Now it sounds very small, like it's 3 megabytes. When you do an npm install, you download basically half of the planet, right? What's 3 megabytes? Unless you're a front-end developer, and everyone is like, do not bring 3 megabytes to the front end. But essentially, that meant that now every time there's a PHP install somewhere or some SDK dependent on it, those are like 3 megabytes that being sent over the wire. Couple that with the amount of downloads that happened throughout time back at 2019, there's like a ton of transmission going on there. And so one thing that this person, this maintainer asked themselves is, or you could probably ask yourself as well, is how often is that a concern for you, right? The size of the library itself. What if you knew that you were actually doing some harm by doing that, by people downloading your data? And so Francois found this, very concerning. He was like, this is very problematic. Every time this gets downloaded, over this compound amount of time, there's something like 11 metric tons of CO2 getting into the emissions. And so he actually admitted and said that being a significant contributor to basically to harmful climate is something that he does not want to do anymore. And he took stand and said, I am going to deprecate this. And so at this time, this is like second story of how an NPM package or a PHP package or just an open source project in general with maintainers, we face issues that we did not think about before, right? Before it was something about the law dispute, and now something about climate change. And this is like a very popular library, so what do we do? And so one option that Francois had is, hey, I can just go ahead and literally deprecate and stop the project, or we can maybe pass it into someone else. There's like an open source ecosystem. They can take the project over and have new maintainers. In fact, he actually did try that, but it didn't go as well before. And so he was like, I am not going to do this anymore. And so that's how essentially this ended. And he gave like his love to anyone who wants to fork the project and start anew, but he did not manage anything else in terms of transitioning the project. So some learnings here. Well, first off, I think appreciate maintainers and their responsibilities and accountabilities towards what they do. And maybe secondly, climate issues are here to stay, and we probably all take some part of that. So that is something we should all think of. Last story for today, more recent, and I think maybe impactful to some of us as well, is relating also to sustainability of open source software and what it means to be a maintainer sometimes. So, I promise this one has a fairy tale ending. I like the other two. Hopefully, I leave you with some stuff. So meet Marek. Marek is an open source developer. He maintains a bunch of projects, a bunch of NPM packages as well. Very, very known usually in the ecosystem. One of those is faker.js. Coincidentally, same name, different project, different people. And as you can imagine, this is also, again, a library that helps you do fakes and mocks and all of those things for data stubbing and testing and so on. It gets a lot of downloads, as very common with NPM ecosystems and JavaScript in general. So 12 million downloads over a month for this package. But most of this work by Mark, and by the way, by many other open source maintainers, largely goes very invisible, right? Like it goes unfunded. People work over weekends and their volunteering times and nights to build for open source for every one of us to basically build upon what they build. And many companies also use this as well, right? Like we use this as consumers. We work at companies, and companies don't, they don't have this this reflex of automatically giving back. And so it's very well understood that when this work goes largely unfunded, Mark here back in 2020 put out the GitHub issue and said, to make a statement here, at least trying to, is how can we do this better? Because I do not want to continue doing this work for free. And you could see, by the emojis there on the GitHub issue at the bottom, like people, it resonated, right? Like people accepted, recognized, something is very off balance here between open source and commercial entities using open source. So apparently, Mark was heard, but not so much. And so this is 2 years later into all of this even happening. One sudden day, you go to this library's GitHub project, which again, super popular, tens of millions of downloads a month. And you see this. Basically, no code, nothing. Everything on the GitHub code is nullified. There's no functionality. There's no capabilities. This also joins an NPM package for this, an NPM version, a new version that was released to this project of the version number 6.6.6. Perhaps telling something. And so the other thing that you may or may not see here also is this is a forced push commit, okay? Like there's no history of any code if anyone wanted to get that at that point, okay? The project is literally gone at this point. So it sounded like Mark was, maybe was heard before in that GitHub issue of like no more free work, but it didn't really have any impact, so now he took action and did this. But did anyone actually care? I don't know, maybe not so much, because let's learn about what else happened after this. After the Faker incident with the 6.6.6 version, we learned some new things. In fact, the 6.6.6 version is a package number that you will probably not get if you already use Faker, so you will not get an immediate impact by it, just because of the way that the versioning works. So that's a major Semver version, and if everything is kind of sane with your development environment, your NPM install and updates procedures will not just get new major version updates, which is a great default. Still, that means a lot of NPM packages that are getting in. And Mark, as we said before, has some other projects too, not just this. And so what he did was essentially bring in other projects that he has, like Colors, and figure if he can make the point with them. Colors is a project that gets downloaded by 100 million times a month, okay? This is much, much more painful if something happens there. Not to underestimate the Faker 12 million downloads a month. Colors has this new version called 1.4.1 and then 1.4.2. And it had a new release. And so if you used Colors and just like ran an update locally, you'd probably get this new version, because that's like a Semver minor or patch version. And that's something that would probably, you would update too if there's like a new version. If that happened, then you'd get this new feature. Let me drill in to show you this amazing new feature. Once you install this package and use it, this runs. It's pretty great. Once it was live on GitHub, people actually wanted to suggest new improvements for how to create an infinite loop, which was also great to see. But really, everyone who was affected by this has felt it, okay? Like this is Mary, she was working on Amazon's AWS CDK, and there's Mina was working on Jest and Heroku's Oakleaf, and all of those projects and many, many more were dependent on Colors. And so when Colors had this issue and released this version outside to the public, which had this malicious code in it, this infinite loop that anytime you just use the project required the library, it will just hang. It affected a lot of people. And I think that this number versioning downloads from NPM can give us an impact, right, of a view of how this impact was so severe. By just one day or less that this was released, it was downloaded by hundreds of thousands of CI build systems and developers who are using this. They immediately felt the pain. There are some ways that we could, learn. Let's take some learnings from this. What could we have done maybe differently? Okay, so if you were impacted by Colors, one of the things I would say generally, right, like work with a log file, so that new npm installs are, very deterministic. You do not, bring in new dependency updates every time you just run it on a project. Still, if you update, that's like another issue, right? If you were impacted by one of those issues and you wanted to remain in a specific version range, you could just go and use npm's overrides feature, which allows you to specifically say, regardless of what my other dependencies want me to take as a new version for a package, I want you, the npm package manager, to specifically get only this range. Other ways that I will suggest you is essentially just use packages that are, bots and tools that are essentially helpful for you to manage your updates. Like, don't blindly create updates. Sneak does this. Also, GitHub has Dependabot to do it. And so whatever works for you, use it. But use something that actually automates the process. And specifically with Sneak, we baked in something like a 3 weeks amount of time buffer when a new version comes out to not expose you to either malicious incident, malicious packages, or things like this, which are even just functional ones. So, of course, support your maintainers and do all of those kind of good things. And so, if you can fund them, if you can support them, that is always welcome. The fairy tale ending here is the following. Faker for NPM was a very important project. And so a group of amazing people, random people from the internet, just came together and said, hey, we understood something happened with Faker, and we kind of like want to still maintain this project. They created a new Faker.js GitHub organization and imported the whole code from Mark to this, reserving and crediting his work as well there, and moving it there, and created basically a new home and maintainer set for Faker. So there are some more thoughtful learnings around just using open source in a more recognizable way and just like being more responsible with what you take in. So like looking at all of those things. And there's like, SBOM, you'll hear this a lot. And there's like, software bill of health, which you'll hear a lot. So I will not get into this a lot in this talk because this is like a whole drill down. So happy to talk about this. My final advice here for you to kind of like understand and recognize when you use open source software and specifically software dependencies is the following. The only thing that actually lasts forever are, well, not dependencies, as we learned. Air miles also not, trust me. Cat videos on the internet, I heard, really do a lot of great job if you want to take views and lasting video on YouTube. So use open source responsibly. Hope you are able to fund it as well and sponsor it. And thank you all for taking part of this.
Thank you very much, Liran. Okay, you can stay with us. Please join me on stage.
Okay.
So, first of all, get your questions ready. I have one of my own, but I don't want to steal time. So, first, I would like to thank you on behalf of all of us of Schrödinger Hat and the community, So, allow me for you to be the first speaker to get this prize. We
Amazing.
3D printed this with eco-sustainable plastics, I guess. Nice. And so, welcome and thank you for being here, really, from the bottom of our hearts.
Thank you so much
You
for
make
having me.
the world of programming better. So thank you. Thank you very much. Stay here for a bit. Okay. So any questions for our friend Liran?
No. More questions.
He didn't want to answer questions.
Didn't realize that.
Okay. Any at all?
Let's do it. Let's do it.
Where? Okay, there you go. I'm coming to you.
Thank you. Amazing presentation. Do you think the behavior of the faker maintenance was unresponsible, or is it something that is it reasonable to expect from him? Thank you.
It's putting me on the spot here because I literally have several hats on this. I think I would not do it, but I'm not going to judge anyone else. We take open source software, like I said, for granted, right? And we were delivered and using that open source software with a license that basically says, you know, you take all the responsibility is on you. I hold nothing to it. And so we have to be more, I think, responsible and manage risks when we use open source. And at the same time, you know, understand that those things can happen. And a lot of bad could have happened for Marek and other people as well, or like their packages, sorry. Not technically happening, like let's say the NPM registry is down or Ruby gems or whatever, like we'd all be suffering from this. So there's like, we need to like manage the way that we use open source software. At the same time, it's hard to judge someone who might be going through a lot of difficult times. So I can only speak for, and you know, all of you will probably, you know, as citizens of open source will own your own actions and can do better and decide if this is the action you want to take or something else. That's basically it.
Citizens of open source, that's beautiful. Very beautiful. Thank you. If there are no more questions, okay, there you go.
I go. Wait.
Mike is gonna come. Yeah, right there.
Thank you. Is it working? Okay.
Yes.
Have you ever heard about the Hippocratic license? And if you have, do you think this is like something meaningful for the community?
I've not heard of that.
Okay, thanks.
Other questions?
Okay. Any more questions? Great. It's time for my question.
There we go.
So no, it's a kind one. Don't worry.
Okay.
So I'm actually wondering. I'm kind of into licenses myself. Very niche, but kind of nice. So I was wondering, do you think there is a chance at some point, in some time in the future, that we as a community can come up with some kind of regulations, public-wise and politically-wise, to kind of engage licensing in a way that doesn't hurt the economy, but at the same time doesn't hurt the creators, which are kind of the base of this economy? What do you think?
It's a good way of asking whether we are having sustainable open source software, I guess.
Yeah, I went around it.
Yeah. Some ideas that were we were entertaining for GitHub were around things like bug bounties for issues. So if you're a company that uses, you know, a bunch of open source software, and you needed a feature, so instead of like bugging the maintainer, like people usually do, and say, I need this feature, I need this bug fix, you would actually put a bounty around it and like literally say, like, I'm willing to pay X amount of dollars for this and put it out there. And so the maintainer would still hold like, hey, like, this is out of scope or whatever, or they could end up doing it and get recognized for it and funded for it. I don't know if this will end up happening. There are some platforms that do that. Tidelift has some commercializations around maintainers. There are other platforms who attempt to do this bug bounty thing, unrelated to like Open Collective and things like that. I think it's something that we should definitely consider because of the strain that is on the shoulders of open source maintainers. So I would love to see it happening. You said in the near future, I hope so.
Let's hope so. Round of applause for our good friend Liran. Thank you very much.